Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations, its place in Charlotte history, then and now. I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm a community historian, and you can find more of my work at www.historysouth.org. I retired recently from Levine Museum of the New South, where I was the staff historian for many years. I've also worked with the Historic Landmarks Commission in Charlotte. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations is the human relations agency for the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. The department seeks to enhance community harmony and promote awareness of Charlotte-Mecklenburg's growing multiculturalism by facilitating community dialogue, addressing discrimination through enforcement of the city's fair housing ordinance, collaborating with the police, serving as mediators in conflict resolution, and ensuring Americans with Disability Act compliance. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations has its roots in the civil rights movement in Charlotte. And what I'd like to do today is give a sense of how the organization came to be, but also to place it in its wider context. I'm going to start out by talking about the era of deepening segregation from the 1900s into the 1960s that sets the stage for the civil rights movement in general and specifically for the Community Relations Office. Then I'll talk about that civil rights movement and how the office got its start in 1961. Finally, I'll talk about Charlotte's changing ethnic and racial landscape today, particularly with regard to housing and geography. Part 1, Deepening Racial Segregation. Today, if you go to Levine Museum of the New South, you can see the actual white and colored signs from Charlotte City Hall. Most of us who are older Charlotteans, older Southerners, remember these painful symbols of segregation. The separate but equal world, as it was called. It was always separate. It was never equal. And few people, though, are familiar with how all of that got started. The fact is that racial segregation, housing segregation, was not as pronounced in the late 19th century as it was in my youth. If you look at Charlotte into the 1890s, you can see a surprising amount of mixture. For instance, at the lower left of this slide, you'll see Spirit Square, the white Baptist church built in the years right after 1900. And at the top of the slide with the blue dot is First United Presbyterian Church, a black church, built at almost the same time. It's across from Levine Museum of the New South. In my youth, it would be inconceivable that these two churches would be built so close together. My book, Sorting Out the New South City, goes into this in more detail if you're interested in checking out that history. I apologize for showing this slide. This is a tough part of our history, but this is really important because it was a time that was a hinge in history for the South and indeed for the United States. In the 1890s, there was an economic downturn, an honest-to-gosh depression, much worse than the recession that we've recently lived through, the 2008 recession. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed that politics has become kind of more ugly, a lot more name-calling, a lot more willingness to blame them. Ever since 2008. Well, imagine what things were like in the 1890s. The beginning of the tumult came as ordinary white folk, not the men of property and standing, but ordinary working class folk, small farmers, joined with African Americans who could still vote in North Carolina well into the 1890s in something called the Fusion. And they began using government to help the little guy. It brought a backlash. The men of property and standing did not like that. How dare you take government out of the hands of the men who own the property and put it in the hands of those who are ignorant and own no property, said the mayor of Charlotte. It was time, said the Charlotte Observer, which was very much on the side of the men of property. They were their advertisers. It is time to end this rule of Negroes and the lower class of whites. It was a statewide movement to use white supremacy as a wedge issue. They called it the White Supremacy Campaign. And you can see here that this cartoon in the Raleigh News and Observer shows the monster of Negro rule having laid waste North Carolina. Its foot is on our ballot box. Its hands are reaching out for our women and children. If you can convince people that their economic interests are at stake and that their safety of their women and children is at stake, then you got them. And indeed, this campaign worked. In 1900, North Carolina, along with many other southern states, voted in a new constitution with voter suppression, poll tax, you had to pay to vote, a literacy test, which sounds innocent, but you had to be able to read and interpret the Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. Voting participation nosedived in North Carolina and all across the South. Well, that's the politics. But what happened with the hate that was stirred up in the 1890s was the separate but equal Jim Crow system that I grew up with 50, 60 years later. Separate black and white water fountains. 1896, first time in Charlotte, there are separate black and white waiting rooms at the Seaboard Airline Railroad Station. You have to sit at the back of the bus if you're African American. That's a new state law in 1903. You have to swear on a Bible in court. Right after 1900, in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg courts, there are separate white and colored Bibles. And that kind of separation carries through to all aspects of society. There are deed restrictions that suddenly appear out in the suburbs of Elizabeth and Dilworth, places like that, that say you cannot buy property here unless it is to be used by members of the Caucasian race for a house costing not less than X number of dollars, which is not just racial segregation, but also economic segregation. And you can see it indeed in the older parts of the city as well, a dramatic change. This is a piece of First Ward in 1875. First Ward is the area around where Levine Museum of the New South is. Charlotte was big enough to be split into 4 election districts, 4 wards, and I've just picked one at random. Here is where African Americans and others lived in 1875. It was very much, as you saw with those churches, intermingled. That's 1875. Here is the same part of First Ward in 1910, 10 years after the white supremacy campaign, before and after. Segregation did not just happen. Segregation happened at a particular time of fear, economic hardship, and it happened through decisions that were not planned overall, but were very intentional. Government decisions, private decisions that split us apart. You can see that split in our landscape if you know how to look for it. If you've been out to Noda, the beautiful little downtown that's now art galleries and such across from Heist Brewery, the old Highland Park No. 3 mill. 1903, when that was built, there was a downtown minister who said, just at this point in the development of the mill people, those white working class folks who'd voted the wrong way in the 1890s, just at this point in the development of the mill people, perhaps it is better to let them have their own churches and schools and stores rather than mix promiscuously with the better class. Segregation, economic, very intentional. African American neighborhoods pop into focus at this point. The most impressive of them was Second Ward, the Brooklyn neighborhood where the government center is today. There's J.T. Williams, one of the last African American elected officials until our era. He went on to be the U.S. Top diplomat to Sierra Leone in West Africa. That's his house at the lower left. His church in the center actually still stands. That's Grace AME Zion Church, and also the office building he helped build. There was the first black public library in North Carolina, the Second Ward High School, a complete city within a city. That's why they called it Brooklyn. It was a lot like the community of Brooklyn in New York, which had become a city within a city in the 1890s. Well-to-do folks pulled away from the city as well. Myers Park, 1911, beautiful greenways, curving streets, gates at the front. A couple of those gates still exist. Was where the men in property and standing lived. And have you ever been lost in Myers Park? I can't prove it, but I think that's intentional. It's a way of separating our residences from the residences of the rest of the city. So that kind of separation is something that began to come into being in the first few years of the 20th century, and then it accelerated in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and indeed in the 1960s. Federal government helped with that inadvertently. 1930s, the Depression was on. The mortgage market froze, just like it did in 2008. Lenders just wouldn't lend. They were scared. And so in the 30s, the federal government sent mappers around to local communities, talk with the men of property and standing, say where the good neighborhoods are, create uniform maps. That way somebody, say in Boston, has money to lend. They'll feel confident lending in Charlotte or Youngstown or wherever. By asking the men of property and standing where the good neighborhoods were, of course, they picked out their neighborhoods. You can see the green neighborhoods of Eastover and Myers Park at the lower right, Dilworth at the center right, the Country Club area in Plaza Midwood in the upper right. If you drew a red line around a neighborhood, it meant that banks would be foolish to lend there. You really don't want to make home loans in a red-lined neighborhood. Now, if you think about that, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because African-American neighborhoods, even mixed-race neighborhoods, over time become more and more the province of absentee landlords. Very hard to buy your own home, to invest in your neighborhood in that way if you don't have help from the bank. And it got worse. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration got started, again, a great program. They helped banks make long-term mortgages, FA mortgages, VA mortgages, Veterans Administration mortgages. But the new FHA did not want to lend in neighborhoods that were going to go bad. And so they hired a sociologist in Chicago. He went around and talked to the men of property and standing in Chicago. And he said, what makes a good neighborhood? And they talked about ethnic groups. The most favorable come first in the list. Those exerting the most detrimental effect appear last. This is the FHA underwriting manual. This is a federal document. Best groups: English, Germans, Scots, Irish, Scandinavians. Second, North Italians. Third, Bohemians or Czechoslovakians. Those are my people. Maybe I should be relieved to be third. I think I'm angry to be third. Fourth, Poles. Fifth, Lithuanians. Sixth, Greeks. Seventh, Russian Jews of the lower class. 8, South Italians. 9, Negroes. 10, Mexicans. Today, I think that inspires a touch of horror in us, but that was federal policy. And it gets worse. In the 1950s and 60s, there was federal money to tear down blighted neighborhoods. One of the key metrics was whether a neighborhood had a lot of rundown absentee landlord housing. Well, guess which neighborhoods had those? And in reality, usually it was the African-American neighborhood closest to downtown that was demolished. In Charlotte, Brooklyn came down during the 1960s. More than 1,000 families displaced, more than 200 black businesses closed, never reopened, more than a dozen churches kicked out of Brooklyn. So all of that deepening segregation, brings us to the time of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement had been going on for a long time before white America really became aware of it in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It had been going on for a long time in Charlotte. 1951, a lawyer named Thomas Weich worked with his neighbors to file a lawsuit attempting to desegregate Revolution Park on the southwest side of the city. The golf course in particular was the only municipal golf course. There were African American professionals who liked to play golf. They couldn't play. 1951, they filed a lawsuit. If that lawsuit had been decided quickly, we probably would be reading about public park desegregation in Charlotte in all of the history books, the same way that we read about public bus desegregation by Rosa Parks a few years later in all the history books. But instead, it took many years for that suit to be decided, but Revolution Park was desegregated. Similarly, 1954, Thomas Weich and African-American dentist Reginald Hawkins and some friends went out to the brand new airport terminal, just opened in July of 1954. Federal project with federal money. The federal world was supposed to be desegregated. Interstate transport was supposed to be desegregated. But the dining room at the airport was not. And they sat in, filed a court case in 1956, long before the sit-in movement. Charlotte's airport desegregated. So people here were working, trying to find some way to change this world of inequality. 1957, Reginald Hawkins, Thomas Weich, Kelly Alexander from the NAACP chapter in Charlotte work with Herbert Spa, the superintendent of schools, to win admission of 4 black students to white schools in Charlotte. This was belated. The Supreme Court in 1954 had said in the Brown decision that desegregation had to happen, but they said with all deliberate speed. What does that mean? Well, it took a long time. In 1957, 4 students went to black students went to white schools. Here is the most famous of them, Dorothy Counts, who went to Harding High School, was met by a mob, not a violent mob, but an ugly mob. These photos were on the front pages of newspapers all across the United States. It really, though, wasn't until 1960 when this became a mass movement. And the folks that did that were not part of the African American power structure, as people like Dr. Hawkins and Attorney Weich had been. They were students. And you know this story. Students at A&T University in Greensboro, including Franklin McCain, later a longtime Charlotte resident, began the sit-in movement in early February. It spread to historically black colleges around North Carolina and then around the South, hit Charlotte about a week later. And that student movement, here you see folks sitting in Charlotte, took months, but it began to really bring a change. One of the people, by the way, who led that is still around. If you all have not met Charles Jones, spokesperson for Charlotte's 1960s sit-ins, he is a wonderful resource and has the ability to make you laugh, to make you angry at the injustices of the past and the present, and to make you cry at the courage of those who fought so long and so hard. Well, out of that student movement, this sense that students were rising up and they couldn't be controlled, came the Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee. Mayor James S. Smith, February 1960, brought together older, cooler heads to work with the students, black as well as white. And it was a courageous thing to do for a Southern political leader to say we are not going to use police dogs and fire hoses as Bull Connor did in Birmingham a few years later, but we are going to talk. And that tradition of talking, at that moment, that became Charlotte's legacy going forward. Here is the actual memo. It's the UNC Charlotte Archives, in which the committee has worked out the desegregation of key lunch counters downtown at Belk, Grant's Five and Dime store, Ivy's department store, Kress, Liggett's. You can see that Sears isn't quite sure at this moment, and Woolworth. This is dated July 4th, 1960. And indeed, Charlotte's lunch counters desegregated at a time when many cities across the South said no, never, and continued to fight. That itself would have been a good thing if the Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee never did anything else. But then in 1961, Mayor Stan Brookshire was elected. Stan Brookshire is the guy the Brookshire Freeway is named for. And he was very much an activist mayor. And he looked at this committee and he said, let's make it a permanent thing. He renamed it the Mayor's Committee, the Mayor's Community Relations Committee in 1961 and expanded its scope. Don't just deal with sit-in issues, deal with issues of housing, deal with issues of economic opportunity, make the connections, do the talking that we need to begin to bring us together as a true community. Just a few things that happened in the next few years to give you a sense, and I'm not sure exactly how the Community Relations Committee was involved in these, but I know that the fact that people talked to each other put Charlotte at the forefront, particularly in May of 1963. You know that May 20 is Mech Day, the day we celebrate our colonial freedom. Well, on May 20th, 1963, Dr. Reginald Hawkins, that African-American dentist, led a march of Johnson C. Smith students down to City Hall and demanded the segregation at upscale, the end of segregation at upscale restaurants. The lunch counters had desegregated, but then the white tablecloth restaurants, even cafeterias, movie theaters, were still segregated. And Hawkins made a stirring speech. The time for tokenism is over, the kind of one-by-one token desegregation that you saw with the schools. So the time for tokenism is over, the time for gradualism is over. We want freedom, and we want it now. And a remarkable thing happened. Brookshire listened. It helped that that very month was when Bull Connor in Birmingham had the police dogs and fire hoses out, was on international television, making the South look like a police state. Brookshire said that's bad for business. Brookshire got Chamber of Commerce officials to invite African Americans to lunch, one or two at a time, going to each of those upscale restaurants. They called them in advance. They talked with the newspapers and said, you don't want to cover this until after it's happened. And it worked. Within a week, most of the upscale restaurants desegregated. Within a few weeks, the movie theaters, everything else desegregated. It was mentioned in the New York Times. The folks at the Kennedy White House were aware of it. It was a year before this became a national requirement through the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At that moment, Birmingham was vying with Atlanta to be the leading city of the New South. Today, Charlotte is 3 times the size of Birmingham. It was a moment at which Charlotte staked its destiny on equality. Hasn't been perfect, still working at it, but this was a key moment. Reginald Hawkins paid a price for that. So did Kel Alexander, the NAACP chief, Fred Alexander, the first black elected public official in that era, and Julius Chambers, the civil rights attorney. November 1965, in the dark of night, 4 houses bombed. No one ever found out who did it. But folks kept on. Here's a little thing. Elmwood Cemetery still does, an area at the back called Pinewood Cemetery. One was the white section, one was the black section. There was a fence between Elmwood and Pinewood. What the dead white people and the dead black people were going to do, that they needed a fence separating them, no one has ever explained to me. But finally, in January of 1969, Fred Alexander got that fence torn down. Part 3, Charlotte's changing ethnic and racial landscape today. So that segregation that we saw coming into place, which ironically got worse during the 1960s as a result of the demolition of the Brooklyn neighborhood, left a city that resembles many other American cities because they've been through the same forces. The well-to-do sector, here it's in the southeast, a predominantly African-American sector on the opposite side of town, and some kind of in-between sectors, South Boulevard, the east side, not particularly well-to-do, but originally white areas. Well, a fascinating thing has happened. I'm going to focus here on East Charlotte because that's where I live, that's what I know, but it's going on elsewhere as well. Those middling kind of areas, as the U.S. Fair Housing Act took hold in 1968, as the Community Reinvestment Act required that lenders not redline, that they lend in all neighborhoods. East Charlotte, the South Boulevard area, other parts of the city went from being nearly 100% white to being about 25% African American, which is basically Charlotte. They began to look like Charlotte. And in my part of town, there are black pockets and white pockets, but overall, it's been remarkably stable for the last 35, 40 years. Then, in the 1990s, we began to experience a new kind of newcomer wave. For one thing, a tremendous increase in population. If you don't take any other one fact from this presentation, know that in 1990, Mecklenburg County had about 500,000 people. It just recently passed 1 million, doubling in size over 25 years. But a lot of those folks, not a majority, but a significant new small number, are coming from other parts of the world. And this is a new thing for Charlotte. Charlotte had almost no immigrants for most of its history. And then suddenly, in the 1990s, we were the 4th fastest growing Latino city in the United States. Since 2000, we've been the fastest growing major Latino metro in the U.S. And it's not just Latino folks. Folks are coming from Mexico. Yep, they're coming from India. They're coming from Vietnam. They're coming from El Salvador, from Korea, from North Africa, from the Middle East. And where are they going? Well, they're going to those old middling areas as much as anywhere else, to the South Boulevard area, Central Avenue, the east side. And they are not segregating. Now, that is hard to imagine. Because when we think of ethnic America, we think of Chinatowns, we think of Little Italies. Charlotte doesn't have one. I've been told that Charlotte doesn't have much international presence, does it? Because it doesn't have that. But what it does instead is it has these suburban salad bowls. The old suburbs, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, are now inexpensive, they're affordable, and people are mingling like items in a salad. You know, you could still see the lettuce, the tomatoes, the onions, anchovies, whatever, the dressing, but it's a new dish. And you go out on the east side of town, and there's the Cambodian video store next to the Salvadoran deli. There's the Saigon Bistro next to the Arab meat market. There is the European grocery from Bosnia with those amazing sausage sandwiches. And the Vietnamese pool hall with the banh mi submarine sandwiches. That kind of mixture is a new frontier for Charlotte. You can see it in the little shopping centers. You can see it in the mix of housing. Here we are on Central Avenue at Rosehaven, down below some old apartments, above some duplexes and single-family homes. And if you drive by quickly, you say, oh, well, this is the Mexican part of town. And indeed, there's a Mexican grocery store. But in the same shopping center, there's also a pupusa joint from El Salvador. A pupusa, they don't have tacos in El Salvador. They have pupusas, little cornmeal pancakes. Stuff them with beans, with cheese, with chopped pork. Yum. So 2 different cultures here in this one shopping center. Actually, 3 different cultures, because there's a Vietnamese soup parlor. Actually, 4 different cultures. Cedarland, folks from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, even Morocco. And 5 different cultures. Jamila's international cuisine. Jamila and her friend Hamza came here from Somalia in the upper right-hand corner of Africa. Their mosque is around the corner on Progress Lane. In Somalia, women can't start a business. Nobody can start a business. The civil war is on. But here, as they came as refugees, they found that the workers at the airport, a lot of them from North Africa, wanted the food from home. And the taxi drivers who came back and forth carrying that food, many of them from North Africa, they wanted a place for their noonday prayers. So they found cheap rent on Central Avenue. They opened Jamila's International Restaurant. Now it's a restaurant and a grocery store. It's the American dream. And that kind of mixed neighborhood that's evolving on Central Avenue, that kind of new entrepreneurial class, we talk about wanting to welcome entrepreneurs to Charlotte, to make Charlotte a place for new businesses and new ideas. That's what you're seeing in those kind of places. It's instructive to look at a map of where foreign-born folks reside in Charlotte. Indeed, South Boulevard and Central Avenue are heavy areas, but as you can see from the pink areas on this map, international communities are all throughout the city. Very different from the patterns of black and white that I grew up with. So change is happening, and community relations is in the middle of that. We've become a city in which there is no longer a white majority. The rest of the United States will be catching up with us very soon. And none of this has hurt our desirability. Like I said, we just hit 1 million, haven't slowed down a bit, even with the 2008 recession. So as community relations goes about its work, know that it comes from history, that it's part of that grassroots movement for true civil rights in a segregated South, and that Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations is making history. By helping us talk together, it's drawing on an important heritage, but it's a heritage that is very important today as we are becoming a more and more diverse Charlotte.